How much is too much? What should a person be looking at in their diet to prevent, an overloaded amount of oxalate?
Well, our individual tolerance is really hard to measure. So the only thing we have in the literature in terms of is about fatality, right? We know that oxalate will kill you, like that rhubarb leaf example. You may get away with 2 rhubarb leaves before you're dead, and I may only get away with 1, or pick a random number. So there's a good chance that the amount of rhubarb we need to die is different. But the bigger problem is that we don't have any objective way or even good subjective ways to quantify how much toxicity is building up under the scenes. The body has a lot of capacity for hiding what's going on. And for example, well, I don't want to jump ahead too much as it gets to be kind of complicated trying to figure out how much is too much. So the kidney researchers are the ones who've been owning the research on oxalate for 50 years. And what they've demonstrated over and over again is that you can handle maybe 100, maybe 200 milligrams of oxalate a day, probably closer to 100. That's what your kidneys, as a human being in our species, handles about 100 milligrams of oxalate a day. A standard spinach salad is somewhere between 450 and 500 milligrams of oxalate. So one spinach salad could be as much as 5 times too much. A handful of almonds can get you halfway. It can get you to like 70 milligrams of oxalate, if I'm remembering correctly. So if you stack, say, a pint of iced tea, 25 milligrams, 70 milligrams from your almond snack, a handful of chocolate chips, you've exceeded that 100 milligram level. So it's easy to stack them in small amounts, but if you start doing things like taking a pound of spinach and juicing it or smoothing it, you are at a level where it's really quite dangerous. I call that the danger zone. We know that if you're eating more than 250 milligrams a day, that defines a high oxalate diet, and 600 is considered extremely high oxalate. So 600 milligrams is known to be a toxic level of exposure, but your standard spinach smoothie is going to be closer to 1,000 milligrams of oxalate.
You wrote about, I think it was Chris Hemsworth in your book.
Liam, poor Liam. Hey, Chris always gets the fanfare, but it's Liam.
Okay, my fault. And he was doing, I don't know, he's doing some massive amount of smoothie and then vegetarian eating as well. And then, got tremendously sick. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, he described it in his Men's Health interviews that he had, and it came out in the US Men's Health and in Australia Men's Health. And he described it as 5 handfuls of spinach in his smoothies. And I think some days he would have 2 smoothies, and he was also on a essentially vegan diet. His wife at the time was vegan at that time. And so he was eating a pretty high oxalate diet. And he got so sick that he missed the premiere for Isn't It Romantic, a movie he starred in, and he missed the awards banquet as well. He was in the hospital having kidney stone surgery. And he told me that his doctors didn't help him at all. He didn't understand why his kidneys failed like that and why it's ruining his career and the fun parts of his career. Like, he worked so hard to get a movie done. The fun moments is to hang out at the banquet and to go to the premiere, and he missed them both. And he found my website and he found out what happened to him. And so I assume he's turned that around now. We haven't heard him whining about kidney stones since. So let's hope. And this is the case that once you get oxalates out of the diet, you pretty much can reverse a problem like kidney stones.
So people listening to this that have had a history of chronic kidney stones, 100% reversible. What kind of time frame would you say? I know that everyone's different. Everyone's a different size. Everyone's a different detox level. Everyone's got a different load internally. But in your experience working with people or talking with people, interviewing people, what kind of time frame would you say is reasonable?
Well, you have to step back and understand that there's 2 phases of toxicity. There's that acute phase, like right after you do the spinach smoothie, now your circulating immune cells are crying, and within 4 hours, you've got this peak. Now, because it takes 24 hours or so for food to pass through the whole system. And so you have this time lag of oxalates being absorbed, and the peak of that's around 4 hours, and it lasts about 10. So you can get some acute symptoms in that absorptive phase. But during that peak, you have this trigger problem going on where you're starting to accumulate oxalates anywhere in the body where you have any kind of injury, overuse, infection, inflammation. Those are areas where oxalate starts getting hung up because the little bits of cell debris and so on in tissues, that creates this environment where the oxalic acid molecules precipitate into crystals, and then they stick, and areas of inflammation are very sticky to oxalate. Inflammation changes the orientation of connective tissue molecules and cells, so they become more sticky and more prone to adhesions and those kinds of problems. So there's the acute phase, but this eating oxalates every day. You start as a kid being given sweet potatoes as a baby, and then you're given peanut butter, and then it's your first birthday and you're having chocolate cake. And then it's potatoes, is like tater tots at lunch every day at school, and then at night it's like chips or fries. You running out to McDonald's or whatever. So we're exposed to enough of these trigger doses and what we call maintenance doses, where the crystals that set up after that during that peak time stay in the tissues indefinitely because we never really take a break. What I think of as wintertime, when you would eat a lot less plant foods and your body would normally clean out annually, if not more routinely than that. But now with this chronic use of the same foods all the time, how old you are and how early you started accumulating oxalates. Did you start as a fetus? Did you start as a breastfeeding infant? Where did that begin and what tissues it affected makes the picture really different in everybody. And so the kidneys, I think, are the first tissue that tries to, now that you've stopped delivering oxalates with every meal, they start removing oxalate deposits that are often as this, what we call nephrocalcinosis, which is diffuse crystals where the kidneys have had to hold on to them. This is a self-defense strategy where the tissues all over the body deliberately sequester and hold on to crystals, expecting winter to come, expecting a time when there's not a constant influx. And you finally give that, once you become oxalate aware, you start reducing it. Now you give the body permission to go after all these stores. Hopefully it starts in the kidneys, but sometimes it starts elsewhere. And so the symptom pattern is different. But usually people at least get a honeymoon period for a minimum of 4 days after they start the diet, if they go abruptly into it, which is not the ideal way to do it, because the huger the leap from a high oxalate diet to a low oxalate diet, the more clearly the body hears the opportunity, and the more likely you're going to trigger a strong immune response of, okay, time to try again, because getting crystals out of tissue is really tough work for the immune system and can turn it into a big frustrated mess. It's very much like having asbestosis, where you have particulate matter lodged in tissues. The immune cells try to deal with it and they get in this frustration mode because the crystals are so hard to consume, because they literally try to consume them and then try to break them down. And there's a lot of frustration, and you just get this sort of enraged immune system that's desperately trying to help you. But if it's too much all the time, you cause lots of toxicity and lots of misery, and you're generating autoimmune problems, which you probably already generated in the exposure in the acute phase. I've seen people say they thought they had diabetes, just disappears when they go on low oxalate. And then it shows up in peaks where their blood sugar is now out of control when they're in these phases of oxalate clearing from tissues.
So let me just back up just a minute. It sounds like you eat a lot of oxalate consistently over a lifetime, and then when you cut it out, you can begin this clearance process. The faster you cut it out, the more aggressively you cut it out, the more potential for a dumping syndrome or a detox type of syndrome versus not. And it sounds like, too, going back to the earlier question that I asked you, which is why are oxalates potentially more of a problem today or not? And you said they're not really more of a problem today, but one of the things that I heard you just now say was that we no longer seasonally eat. And so we have all this food that's available 24/7, 48, 24 hours a day, right? That used to be seasonal, but now we're importing from all over the world. And so we have this opportunity to always eat oxalate consistently day in and day out. And so there's never a winter of, hey, let's let our body get this stuff out. And so it crystallizes these components into our tissues, which can create symptoms in and of itself. But then when we do finally get a break, if we recognize it as part of our problem and our body tries to break it down, our immune cells really struggle to break those things down, creating a kind of a mess, a storm, if you will, of inflammatory chemicals that can also create spikes sporadically of symptoms as we're trying to pull this stuff out of us. So all that being said, time frame wise, let's just go from what's the longest time frame you've seen somebody really struggle, and what's the quickest, kind of shortest time frame that you've seen somebody do really well?
Well, even in the initial response, you get that honeymoon period where you feel great for a few days, and then it seems like your symptoms come back, and you think, oh, well, that wasn't the issue, and you go back on the food and back and forth. But interestingly, I often get a lot of clients who come to me from going from, say, keto, which is a lot of almond flour and spinach and sometimes dark chocolate, to carnivore, which is zero plants for the most part, although they usually keep some coffee and maybe some chocolate or something. And they don't always even see any of this clearing stuff start until years later, 2, 3, even 6 years later. So, and that just opens up obvious set of scientific questions like, well, if you're not taking calcium and you're not doing these other things, and you may not have the metabolic ability to go after those deposits, and you may not get this clearing thing right away. So it's then we have, all right, so what is the healing? If you've been like me and you've been eating Swiss chard your whole life and beet greens and had health problems your whole life, and now you realize that almost all of it or all of it seems to be explained by the oxalate problem. What is that trajectory of healing? Usually, there's a struggle to learn the diet and learn what that pattern of clearing looks like for you and what kinds of issues show up for you. And then you realize, oh, here's a hip pain now, and that hangs around for 5 months. And then here's the other hip or some knee or some other body part that hangs around for months. Other people go into these little short bursts where you get some gout, and then it disappears. It might stay for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then it comes and goes. So that's a healthy immune system, by the way, that can go after a problem, decide whether that's going to work or not, and decide to take a break. Because your immune activity like this is meant to be short-term response to injury, not to be on all the time. So if you can turn it on and off, that's a good sign that your metabolism is pretty good. So there's lots of variables. I'm just trying to just generally mention a few things that will affect the pattern that you see in response to the diet. So, but generally you see a little bit improvement, then things get a little rocky, then you learn kind of whether you're in clearing or not, and then it can get worse in year 3. Once your kidneys are cleared out, once they've recovered, you've got a better exit strategy now, and the rest of the body seems to be more able to get into the deeper tissues, the tendons, the bones, the eyes, and so on. Interestingly, we think of the kidney as a major tissue of oxalate retention and deposits forming, but the bigger tissues are the bone marrow, the eyes, and the thyroid gland. And you can imagine periodic inflammation in the thyroid gland has all kinds of effects that seem unrelated. And you see things like elevated liver enzymes, and you see various testing being strange, So if you're on a low oxalate diet and you're trying to figure out what is your trajectory and when you're getting better, I think you've set in motion a lifetime of healing. I am now in my 11th year. I know I'm still clearing oxalate. I know I still have oxalates in my spine and tissues like that have been severely affected. So I think your body will continually heal, and whether or not that's symptomatic or not is also really variable. But I would say if you want better quality of life, when is the better quality of life? Usually pretty quick. And usually something like your sleep is suddenly much easier, or you're this or that, your mood is clearer. What surprises me is how many people are finally out of anxiety. They finally can experience calm. They can finally focus and meditate and not be panicky all the time. And that is a huge quality of life thing. So even if your elbow hurts now and then as your body's clearing up, at least you've gained some sense of sanity.